So the supply curve, so now we're talking about producers. And in a market, for the producers, the price is also the most important thing because that will determine how much they get paid. And for the producer, though, they will have a positive relationship with the price because the higher the price, the more profit they're going to make, and the more profit they're going to make, the more they will want to produce that good. Okay, so for example, we have supply schedule for shoes. As the price goes up, the quantity that the supplier wants to make will increase. And then, putting that on the graph, we would get a straight line. So this example starts at the origin, but it doesn't have to start at the origin. A lot of examples have a supply curve that starts up here, but it will always be an upward sloping function because the price and quantity will be positively related. Okay? Higher prices mean more profit. More profit means they want to produce more. All right, so price and quantity are positively related, and that's given by the law of supply. So all other things equal, quantity supplied increases as price increases. And again, we have to start with that assumption that ceteris paribus, all other things equal, because there are other things that will influence how much a seller wants to sell. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. All right. Okay. Now, the supply curve illustrates decisions by the producer. And so what it illustrates is what quantity they would want to sell dependent on what the price is. If the price changes, then they would be at a different point on the supply curve. So if there's a price change, it will cause a movement along the curve. So say at $10, if the price were $10, the supplier would be at this point on the supply curve, and at $20, they would be at that point. Okay, so a change in price causes a movement, and then we call that a change in quantity supplied. So a change in the price will cause a movement along the supply curve and a change in the quantity supplied. So what we're doing is we are talking about decision making. We're illustrating it, and then you guys are also learning some phrases that are used to describe the changes. Okay, so phrase here, change in quantity supplied. So what that implies, or what that tells you, is that the price has changed, and then the producer has responded by deciding to produce a different quantity. All right, here the price increases from $20 to $30. So using that same supply curve, we can see then that the seller would increase the amount they want to sell from 10 to 15. So that will cause a movement up the curve. All right, so the seller is mostly motivated by profit, of course. That's why they're selling the good in the first place. They want to make a profit. And so the price affects the profit because that's how much they get paid. The profit that they get is the price they're paid minus what? Costs, that's right. So minus what they have had to pay for to make the good. So their profit can change either when the price that they're paid changes or when the cost that they have incurred changes. So if the price goes up, they want to produce more, like in that picture there, because when the price goes up, they make more profit. But another thing that can increase their profit is if the costs go down. Now, we illustrate that in a different way, though. So if the price stays the same and the cost goes down, now they're making more profit. They want to make more, but the price has stayed the same. What would that look like? A shift, that's right. It's going to mean a new curve, and in that example, it would be over to the right. So let's say the price is still $20, but now that their costs have gone down, they want to make more, even though the price is still $20. And so that's going to mean a new point over here somewhere. And so that means that the curve would shift. Okay, so things that will shift the supply curve. All right, so first is the cost of production. Now, we use the word input to describe the resources and materials they're using to make the goods. So when we say that their costs have changed, it's because the price of the inputs has changed. All right, so that's the first one here. Okay, so change in input prices. So this is a list of things that will shift a supply curve. So number one, changes in input prices. So for example, if the input prices increase, that means that it will cost them more to produce the goods. So cost of production would increase. That means their profit goes down, so then the producers would supply less. So what would be happening in that situation is you have a business, and your business produces usually like a couple different things at least. Your costs go up for one of the things, that thing is now less profitable, so then what you do is you would just start concentrating on some other thing to produce that would be more profitable. Okay, now one of the inputs for a producer is not just the things that they have to pay for, but also the cost of their own time. So we can think of supply and demand in the input markets as well, where labor is an input. And so we can also consider supply of labor. So this would be like you getting a job. So the quantity would be in people or hours of work. And then this would be your wage. So in a labor market, there's also a supply curve that slopes up. And it slopes up because people will want to work more if they get paid more. Right? So if you were offered a job where the wage was only $5 an hour, would you want to work very much? Or maybe not at all, right? So very few people would want to work. So you'd have a very low quantity supply of people who'd want to work for $5 an hour. But if you could find a job where you could make $30 an hour, then more people would want to work, and those who are working would want to work more hours because that's a good wage to earn. So then that would result in a larger quantity. So I'll say Q1, Q2. But this can change so that the cost of your time changes. During the semester, if you're taking like 4 or 5 classes, probably you're not working, right? Or if you are working, not very much, right? Because the cost of your time would be very high. So in that case, if you were taking like 4 or 5 classes, even if you could get a job that paid you $30 an hour, you probably wouldn't want to work a lot. You'd probably only want to work a little bit. And so then your supply curve would be over here more when you're busy. Whereas in the summertime, or not in the summer. Well, if you take the summer off, I should say. I should just say, if you take a semester off, whatever time of the year that is, if you take the semester off, then now you've got more free time. Your cost of working is lower because the cost of your time is lower. And so then at the $30, you would want to work more. Okay, so that is the cost of your time is part of this input price or cost of production for you if you have a business. All right, next thing that will affect profit is technology, because technology also changes the cost of production. So if you get a better machine, for example, better machine means lower cost of production, more profit, you'll want to produce more. Okay, so better technology increases productivity, thereby lowering the costs. All right, so those two factors will shift the supply curve because they influence profit. The next one is when we're referring to the market supply or the total supply in the market, then the number of firms that are supplying the good will affect the total amount that's being supplied. Okay, so number 3, changes in the number of suppliers. This is similar to last week when we talked about population affecting demand, right? Change in population changes the number of consumers, that will change the market demand. So likewise, change in the number of firms will change the market supply. Okay, the next one is also the same as with demand, and that's about expectations for the future, but in particular, future prices. So in particular, future prices, because when you're selling a good, of course, you want to get the highest price possible. And so now, depending on what you're producing, you may or may not be able to hold back on the goods before you sell them. If you can, then it might change how much you want to sell today. So if you're producing something where it's not perishable and you don't have to sell it right away, and you hear that prices are going to go up in the future, then what you might do is just store the goods and wait and sell them once the price has gone up. Or if you hear that prices are going to go down in the future, then you might try to sell as soon as possible before the price goes down. Exactly the opposite of what a consumer will do. So with a consumer, we want the lowest price possible. So we do the opposite thing. If we hear the prices are going to go up in the future, we buy now. And if we hear that prices are going to go down in the future, we buy later, right? We wait. So we do the exact opposite. And so that's one of the reasons why markets like the stock market or housing markets, that's one of the reasons why the prices tend to fluctuate so much. Is not only because the supply and demand are really influenced by expectations, but also because people behave in the opposite ways. And so it really will work to push prices up and then push prices down and push prices up, push prices down. So we'll talk about that later when we put the two curves together. Anyway, okay, let's see. Next one is current events. And this can mean a lot of different things. Okay, this can mean a lot of different things because this could be to do with the climate, it could be political things, it could be like relationships between countries that are changing, right? A lot of different things that can happen that will influence supply. So say one thing that's just happening in the last few days is in Saudi Arabia, they had some attacks on some of their oil factories or refineries or whatever you call them. And then what's that going to do to our gas prices? They're going to go up. Maybe they did already this morning. I'm not sure. I didn't look at on my way in. But gas prices are going to go up like today or tomorrow, right? And then that affects the cost of production for pretty much everything in the economy, right? So costs of production go up, and then that will affect profit, and then that will affect supply. Okay, last one. Producers also have substitutes and complements. So changes in the price of a complement or substitute in production. Okay, but they mean very different things for a producer compared to a consumer. For a consumer, substitutes were two things that were similar, and they provided similar benefits, so the consumer would buy one or buy the other one, usually whatever one was cheaper. Complements for the consumer were two things that had to be purchased together because they had to be used together, like pencils and paper, staples and staplers. Okay, but for a producer, it means a totally different thing. Okay, so a good example is dairy products. All right, so if you have a cow and you milk the cow, then you get milk, but more specifically, it's what we would call whole milk. Or homogenized milk would be, it's made out of whole milk, right? So it's like the richer milk. It's got a bit more fat in it. So that's what comes out of the cow. Now, a lot of people don't drink whole milk, though. Most people like to drink a lower fat milk. So what do the farmers do? They take some of the fat out. They take some of the fat out, and then they get a lower fat milk. But then they also have fat. And what can they make from the fat? Right? Butter. Okay, so to get the butter, you also get the milk. And to get the milk, you also get the butter, right? There's no way to produce one without the other. They just come together at the same time out of the cow. So those are complements. These would be complements, these two. Okay, so they're complements because they are produced at the same time. Now, substitutes for the producer would be when they have something like the milk, and then they can make different things out of milk. So what can you make out of milk? Cheese, yogurt, right? Different kinds of cheese, or you can make cheddar cheese, mozzarella cheese. There's all sorts of different kinds of things that you could make from the milk. So I'll say cheddar cheese, or say yogurt, right? Both are made from the milk. So if you've got the milk, you can make either one. So these are substitutes then, because you can make either one. Another example would be if you're making clothing. So if you're making clothing, you've got a factory, you've got workers who know how to make clothing, you've got the sewing machines to make the clothing. You could make shirts, or you could make pants, or you could make jackets, right? So you've got the equipment, and you could make any of those items. All right, so those would be substitutes for you. Now let's see. Okay, so substitutes. When a producer can use the same set of inputs, like the same equipment, for example, or same ingredients, to produce two different goods. Example, a farmer could make carrots or beets. Carrots or beets. So carrots or beets both require the same kind of land, same kind of climate, same kind of equipment for the farmer. So those would be substitutes. And now which one would the producer want to produce? Whatever's more profitable, right? So if you're making clothing and pants are more profitable, you're going to want to make more pants. But if suddenly the price of shirts goes up and shirts are more profitable, well, now you're going to start making more shirts instead. Likewise here. So if the price of carrots increases, now carrots are more profitable, so they're going to want to use more of the resources they have to make the carrots, which means then they will spend less resources making the beets. So their supply of beets would decrease. They wouldn't want to make them as much of them. Okay, complements are when something is produced together at the same time, or there's what we call a byproduct of production. So one example that I heard about a while ago, and it wasn't in Canada, it was some other country. Anyway, they found a use for cow poop. So cow poop normally would just be a waste product, but somebody figured out that you could make pottery with cow poop. I don't know if there's a big demand for it, but anyway, they figured out how to do it. And so that would be an example of a complement then, because they've got the cows, they're making milk, but then they also have the poop, which they're using to make pottery. Anyway, okay, here the example is the beets. Okay, so now carrots apparently you can eat carrot leaves, although I've never done it. Has anyone ever eaten a carrot leaf? No. Okay, but beets, it is much more common to also eat the leaf. So the leaves are delicious and the roots are delicious. And so you can have two markets for the two different things then, the market for the leaves and the market for the root. Okay, so farmers can sell beet greens or beet roots, and they're grown at the same time, and so that would be a complement. Those would be complements in production. And then the supply of one will be related to the supply of the other because they're grown at the same time. And so if one of these two things becomes more profitable, they're going to have to supply more of both, because the only way of getting more of one is to also produce more of the other one. So here, if the price of the beet leaves increases and now they want more leaves, then of course they will end up supplying more roots as well. Okay. Any questions so far? Now, how to illustrate this on the graph? These things will shift the supply curve. So, the supply curve can shift to the left or to the right, and the way that we describe it will be similar to a shift in demand. It will be a change in supply, either an increase in supply or a decrease in supply. Okay, so now we'll summarize what you've learned so far. So to describe the decision making by a producer, you have a supply curve that describes the quantity that the producer will sell depending on what the price is. And if the price changes, then you illustrate that by showing the new point with the new price and the new quantity they want to supply. And that is movement along the curve when the price changes. But then if something else changes the circumstances, so we went through 6 different things just now, those will shift the supply curve, because what those other factors are doing is they are changing the quantity that the seller wants to sell, even if the price hasn't changed. So even if the price is the same, something else is happening that makes the supplier want to supply more or supply less. And so that's a shift or a change in supply. Okay. All right, so we have our 2 phrases here. A change in quantity supplied, so that tells you it is a movement along the curve, or a change in supply without the word quantity. That means it is a shift or it's a new curve. All right, so movement along the curve or a shift of the curve. The reason for them, this, just a price change, right? The only thing that's going on here is that the price has changed, and then that is changing the quantity the seller wants to sell. If it's a change in supply, that means that something else has changed, and we can't tell what it is from the graph. Here we can tell that it's a price change. Here, we're not sure what's going on, but it could be one of those 6 variables or 6 factors that we had just went through. All right, so price is the only one that causes this, whereas we have 6 different things that could possibly cause a shift. All right, any questions? Okay. Yeah.
One thing I don't really understand is that, like, just because the profit margin increases, why would they want to produce more?
Okay, so most producers will be producing maybe possibly a couple different things. So say myself, for example, I can teach Econ103, or I can teach Econ105, or I also teach Econ260. Now, they do all pay me the same, but if one of them paid me more, which one would I want to teach more? The one that pays me more, that's right. And then I would teach less of the other one that paid less, yeah. So as a producer, if you were making clothing and you could make shirts or pants, you're just going to want to concentrate more on whatever one is more profitable. Yeah.
But isn't that little demand? Like, do we not consider?
Yeah. So demand will then influence the price. Yeah. So as a producer, you do think about demand, because demand will influence the price. So if demand increases, price will increase. You'll want to make more of that good. Yeah. Okay, which we'll get to in a couple pages. So in a couple pages, we're going to put the 2 curves together, and then we'll talk about how the price is determined for the market, and then how that can change. Okay, all right, so exercise 2. Now this is about banana milkshakes again. We had an exercise last class about banana milkshakes, but we were talking about demand for banana milkshakes. And now we'll talk about supply for banana milkshakes. Okay, one, the number of producers decreases. So there's fewer producers making banana milkshakes. Which way will it shift? Left, yeah. Now, one thing that comes up often with students when you're learning how to draw the curves shifting back and forth is that when you're thinking about supply increasing or decreasing, you want to think of going right or left, not up or down. Because when you draw the supply curve going to the left, it is actually going up. And so then some students get confused and think that going up means an increase in supply. But that's not correct. You have to think of it as going to the left, like a less quantity, so decrease in supply. Okay, so to the left, good. A new, more powerful milkshake making machine is purchased by the producers. What will happen to supply? Increase, yep, it'll move to the right. So they will want to supply more because that will make it faster or less costly. All right, now the next one. Okay, banana muffins are a substitute in production. Okay, so remember this is, the word substitute means something different for the producer compared to what it means for a consumer. For a consumer, the muffin and the milkshake would not be substitutes, right? A substitute for the banana milkshake would be maybe like a chocolate milkshake, right? Something that's very similar, just a slightly different flavor. For the producer, the muffin is a substitute because they have bananas and they have a kitchen. So they can make banana muffins or banana milkshakes or banana pancakes or whatever, right? You can make whatever out of bananas. So those would be the substitutes in production. And so if you've got your kitchen and a bunch of bananas, then you want to concentrate on whatever's more profitable. And so the price of banana muffins increases. All right, so now muffins are more profitable. Now this is milkshakes. So what will happen to your supply of milkshakes? Decrease, that's right, or move to the left. Yeah, so your supply of milkshakes will decrease because you're now concentrating more on muffins. All right, now bananas are imported, so the exchange rate will influence costs. Stronger Canadian dollar makes bananas cheaper. All right, so now bananas are cheaper, your profit increases, you'll want to supply more. Producers expect the price of banana milkshakes to decrease next month. All right, so now you are expecting to lose profit on your banana milkshakes in the near future. You're probably going to want to just use up the bananas that you have in preparation for starting to produce more of something else instead. So you're going to want to use up your bananas. You're going to want to sell more now, right? Like before the price goes down. Yeah, so right now you will want to sell more before the price goes down. Last one, the price of banana milkshakes increases. What's that going to do? Yeah, so they're going to want to make more, but it's not a shift. It's a price change. So we illustrate that as a movement, and it's a movement up the curve. So the price goes up. So what we can do is just put P1 and then P2. So the price goes up, and then illustrate what points those would be on the curve. So at the low price, they are only selling a small quantity, and then at the higher price, they will sell more. So whether the costs change or the price changes, both change profit and then therefore change the quantity that the seller wants to sell. But we illustrate them differently. So like this is a cost change, this one number 4. This one is a price change. Both are changing profit, but we illustrate them differently because the price is the variable here, right? So when the variable here changes, you're just on the same curve, it's just at a different point. Whereas this is a change in another variable that's not on the axes, and so it's a change of circumstances that will influence how much they want to sell, even if the price stays the same. So that creates a new curve. Good. All right. Okay, any questions? Okay. So now we're going to combine the demand and supply functions to determine or to illustrate the prices in a market. So a price in a market is determined by both demand and supply. Okay? So the price in a market is determined by both the demand and the supply of the good. And the price will reach an equilibrium in a market. And we talked about this a bit in chapter 1. And I talked about the example of, say, you trying to sell your car on Craigslist. And so what you do is you look for other sellers selling a similar car. You know that you can't charge a price that's way higher than everyone else is charging because you just wouldn't be able to sell it. So you, the producer, will have to charge a price that's similar because you're selling a similar good to other people. But that price will be influenced by demand as well. If there's a lot of demand for that kind of car, you're going to be able to get a higher price for it. Whereas if people don't really want that kind of car, then you know you're going to have to sell it for a low price. So the price in a market will, it'll reach an equilibrium in the sense that people can't try to pay or be paid a price that's way different than anybody else. Everybody has to be paid or pay a price that's similar to everybody else. And that price will be influenced by both the strength of the demand as well as how much is supplied. Okay, so what determines the price? It is both supply and demand. So one example would be housing prices. Okay, so in Vancouver, you can get a one-bedroom apartment for about the same price as in the Maritimes, probably like a big house and a potato farm, right? So similar prices, big house and a potato farm or a one-bedroom apartment. Why the difference? What's different about Vancouver compared to the Maritimes?
It's better location.
Yeah. And that means people want to live here. Lots of people want to live here. Now the Maritimes is beautiful, very beautiful, but it's cold and they get terrible storms in the winter. And so a lot of people just don't really want to live there. They want to live here. So we have a huge demand for homes. A lot of people wanting to buy the homes. So that's going to make the price a lot higher compared to in Eastern Canada. Okay. So prices will be highest for items. Oh, diamonds are another example. Now diamonds have a high price, not so much that there's a huge demand for them. There is, everybody wants diamonds, but there's also a very limited supply, right? Not a lot of them in the world. Okay, so when there's a limited supply and or a huge demand, then that's going to mean higher prices. Okay, so small supply and or large demand. Whereas things with the opposite, so things with either a low demand, like houses in Newfoundland, or things with a huge supply, like potatoes, those are going to have low prices. So potatoes, have a large demand. Like everybody eats potatoes, right? So there's a very large market demand for potatoes, but there's also a huge supply. And potatoes are also something that's very easy to supply, right? It's not like diamonds where you have to have a lot of expensive equipment in order to get them. Potatoes, pretty much, you just need some dirt and a little water and sunshine, then you can have yourself some potatoes. So large supply and or small demand, that's going to make things cheaper. This is also true for labor markets. Okay, now you guys are all here because you want to get paid more in the future, right? So what you are doing by being here is, or after you graduate anyway, is you're putting yourself into a different labor market compared to people with just a high school degree. Right? People with just a high school degree, there's a large supply. And it's not a strong demand because those people have less education. Whereas if you have a university degree, not as many people have a university degree, right? So a smaller supply, but also a stronger demand because the employers know that you are more educated or more skilled. Okay, so then you'll get paid more. All right, now, markets will move towards an equilibrium. And an equilibrium, so it means two things. It means, as I was talking about before, that prices will be pretty much the same for everybody, right? As long as you're selling and buying a similar good, prices will be very similar. You can't pay or be paid a wildly different price. But what it also means is that there's not going to be a surplus in the market or a shortage in the market. What would happen to the price if there was a surplus in the market, like there was a lot of the good and the sellers were not able to sell it all? What would happen to the price? It would go down, that's right. They'd have a sale, right? They'd lower the price to try and sell the good. And if there was a shortage, so people were lined up trying to get a good, what would the sellers do? They'd increase the price, yeah. Okay, so if a market is in a situation where there's a surplus or a shortage, it's not an equilibrium because the seller will want to change the price to try to fix the situation. Okay, so in a shortage, price would increase, and if there was a surplus, the price would decrease. All right, so now we're going to put the two together, the two curves together, and then see how market will move towards an equilibrium. Okay, so we're starting with a price that's high. Okay, now at this price, we can see the quantity that consumers would want to buy, which is right there. So we'll call that QD. So that's the quantity consumers would want to buy because it's a high price, so they don't want to buy very much. At that high price, the sellers, though, would love it if they could sell lots, and they'd like to sell this quantity here. Will they be able to sell that quantity? No, because consumers are only buying this much. So sellers are going to produce this much, but buyers will only buy this much. So what is that situation? Surplus. That would be a surplus. Okay, so what will the sellers do? If you're a seller and you've got this much to sell and the consumers aren't buying it, then you will have to lower your price. As you lower the price, what will consumers do? they're going to buy more of it, right? And so we show that as a movement down the demand curve. So as you lower the price, consumers will buy more. So this quantity demanded is going to increase. At the same time, as the price is going down, it's less profitable to make the good. So you're going to make less of the good. And so you will decrease, or sellers will decrease the quantity that they are producing. Okay, so as the price goes down, consumers are buying more, sellers are going to produce less. What happens to the size of the surplus? It's getting smaller, right? It's getting smaller. Now, say even at this point here, that's a lower price, but it's still got a bit of a surplus. So that's not yet an equilibrium, because as long as there is still some surplus, some of the sellers will lower their price a little bit more, until this equilibrium. And that equilibrium is an equilibrium because the quantity that consumers are going to buy and the quantity that sellers want to sell is the same. So we call that Q star, and the price that allows for that equilibrium is there, so we'll call that P star. Okay, so the initial price, P1, was not an equilibrium because the sellers saw an opportunity to make themselves better off by being able to sell some of the surplus by lowering the price. And so they did that. So they made the change. They decided to lower the price. Then they were able to sell more. But then they decided to not produce as much of it until the surplus cleared. And that would be at that equilibrium between the supply and demand curve. Okay. There. Okay. So what we saw is, or what we showed in the diagram was a movement down along both the curves until the surplus disappears. So now we'll go through the next example, and what we're talking about here is how a market reaches an equilibrium. So what happened in the first example before the break is that the sellers were trying to charge a price that was too high. They would have loved to have sold lots at that high price, but they couldn't. Buyers were only buying a small amount at the high price, so they had to lower their price. Okay, now the opposite. The price is low. Okay, now sellers will not like that. So at this low price, the quantity that the sellers are willing to sell is very small, right? Not making much profit. They don't want to sell too much of that good. However, the consumers are loving the low price. They really, really, really want to buy lots of the good. Are they going to be able to buy lots? No. They'd like to buy this quantity, but they will only be able to buy that much because that's the quantity that is actually for sale. So what is this situation? Shortage. Okay. So when there is a shortage, then the sellers see an opportunity to increase their prices because people are lined up trying to buy the good. They know that even if they raise the prices, they will still be able to sell everything that they have for sale. So the seller will raise the price. As the seller raises the price, two things will happen at the same time. The seller will then find it more profitable, so they'll start making more of the good. The buyer, it's now more expensive, will buy less of the good. So the quantities will move towards each other. Okay, so as the price goes up, the seller will produce more for sale, and at the same time, the buyer does not want to buy as much. So the shortage was this big at P1, but as the price goes up, because the quantities become closer together, the shortage will get smaller and smaller. As long as there still is a shortage, though, the seller will continue to raise the price, raise the price, raise the price until there's no more lineup at the door. No more lineup at the door is the equilibrium. So that is when the quantity demanded is the same as the quantity for sale. So there's no more shortage, and the price will be, so Q star, P star. Price will be P star. Okay, so what happened as the price increased, there was a movement up both curves until the shortage disappeared. And then we have our equilibrium, and the equilibrium is defined as when the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. All right, so it's an equilibrium, or we can say that the market clears because there's no more surplus, there's no shortage. Sellers are selling everything that they are producing. No more, no less. All right, any questions? Okay, so now we'll do a calculation example. So calculation example, we've got these two equations. All right, so first, graphing the equations. Okay, now, when you draw graphs, again, I don't mark them on how neat and tidy they are, as long as you've got all the important numbers. So for the demand curve, I'll just start with that. So let's just draw a downward sloping line. And then the important numbers would be the intercepts. Okay, so this price intercept is when the quantity is 0. So when the quantity is 0, price will equal 50. Okay, so demand curve, price intercept is 50. And the quantity intercept is the quantity when the price is 0. So I'll just make a little note over here. So 0, so when price is 0, so 0 equals 50 minus 0.4 Q. And so then Q will be 50 over 0.4. And so that will be the quantity intercept. And I already know that that's 125. I'll just draw a little arrow there just so you know where what that's there for. Okay, so now the supply curve. So the supply curve slopes up. But this one does not start at 0, 0. This one starts at $10 on the p-axis. So when the quantity is 0, the supply curve, the price is 10. So it will start at 10. And therefore, we don't need the quantity intercept, because the quantity intercept, so it's going to slope up, right? So we're going to draw it sloping up. The quantity intercept would be somewhere over here in a negative Q, which you can't have. So we just don't draw that part, right? So we're just going to draw starting at here. So when Q is 0, price is 10. Okay, and then it slopes up. Now, what I do when I'm drawing the supply curve, just to make it not look too funny, is to look at the slopes before I draw it. So the slope of the demand curve is 0.4, slope of the supply curve is 0.1. So that is flatter than the demand curve. So you don't want to draw a steep supply curve like that. You want to draw a supply curve that is quite a bit flatter than the demand curve. So I'll put it about there. Doesn't need to be perfect by any means, but you don't want it to be too funny looking, because otherwise it's confusing when you calculate the equilibrium, which is what we're doing next. Okay, so what we want is this equilibrium. We want to know what's that quantity and that price. Okay, so calculating the equilibrium, price, and quantity. So using the equations, demand equals supply. So 50 minus 0.4 Q equals 10 plus 0.1 Q. Okay. So I'll take the 10 to the left side, so 50 minus 10, and I'll take the Q term to the other side. So 0.1 Q plus 0.4 Q. Okay, so this quantity, which we can add a star to, so it's the equilibrium, so Q star, 40 divided by half, so that will be 80. And then we can add that to the diagram. And then we calculate the price, and to calculate the price, we use the quantity that we just calculated, and then we put this quantity back into either of these functions to get the price, because they are equal at the equilibrium. So we can put 80 here, or we can put 80 here. So I'll show both. You don't have to write down both. I'll just show both just to illustrate that you can use either equation. All right, so $18. What will happen if the price is $15? Okay, so here what will happen, well, we'll put it on the graph, we'll illustrate it on the graph, and then we'll also calculate what's going to happen. Okay, so 15 is about there. And at 15, now we're going to not have an equilibrium. Obviously, we're going to have a quantity supplied and a quantity demanded. So quantity supplied there, I'll just put, well, no, I won't write anything yet, because we'll calculate what that is, and quantity demanded. Okay, so let's calculate those two quantities. Now, okay, so the price is 15. So we'll start with demand. So put 15 in for the price. 15 equals 50 minus 0.4 Q. And I'm going to add a little d, just to say that we're calculating the quantity demanded. Okay, so 35 over 0.4, 87.5. Okay, and I'm going to add that to our diagram, 87.5. And then supply. All right, so price is 15. So put that into the supply function. 15 equals 10 plus 0.1 Q. I'll put an SQS. Okay, so that'll be 50, and I'll add that to the diagram. Okay, and then you can finish the answer by saying that there'll be a shortage. So that'll be a shortage of the difference there, shortage of 37.5.